It wasn't the only time that Fleming found inspiration from the Cold War. For the villains in the Bond novels, Fleming drew from a wide range of sources.
Well, Fleming himself wrote that it was particularly hard to produce believable villains, yet he managed brilliantly. He plucked them from real life. There was a high probability if you knew Fleming or you had crossed Fleming that you might end up in his books. The villain's birth that I like most is really the story of Goldfinger, who was based, we are told, on an architect called Erno Goldfinger. Blameless man, and in some ways a rather brilliant modernist architect. But Fleming didn't like his buildings. He particularly didn't like a row of buildings in Hampstead that he used to walk past. And so, entirely as a way of getting at Goldfinger, he called one of his principal villains, not Erno Goldfinger, but Stavro Goldfinger. Now, Goldfinger, the real Goldfinger, was enraged by this, understandably, and even threatened to stop the publication of the book.
Goldfinger decided not to sue, and Fleming's publishers settled his costs. He wasn't the only real-life person turned into a baddie. The newspapers were filled with juicy tales of spies defecting from the Soviet Union, and some of them were even rumored to be assassins.
The West began to wake up to the fact that there were these Soviet James Bonds with licenses to kill, wandering around Europe prosecuting their business, which was fascinating and appalling at the same time.
Fleming was just as fascinated, and even though it didn't exist in Britain's real-life Secret Service, he gave James Bond his own license to kill. One defector, Nikolai Koklov, also came armed with some extraordinary weapons.
He was an experienced Russian spy and saboteur who defected to the West in the 1950s and brought with him a number of rather extraordinary gizmos and gadgets that look as if they came straight out of Q's laboratory. Cigarette cases that fired special poison bullets and that kind of thing. But Fleming cited Koklov and his case as proof that really what he was describing was not impossible at all.
Fleming already had his own personal experience of spy gadgets.
During the war, he was fascinated by the use of particular sorts of technology for particular ends. There was a character involved in the Secret Service at that point called Fraser Smith, who would have made a model for Q had there been a character called Q in the books. There isn't, in fact. There is a Q section which did exist and was involved in creating various sorts of technology. But Fleming did work very closely with Fraser Smith to produce various sorts of gadget and gizmo, exploding golf balls and things that cigarette cases you could hide cameras in and that kind of thing. So Fleming, from an early part of his wartime career, was fascinated by the machines that make espionage run.
Fraser Smith's department also made weapons for Britain's elite agents working behind enemy lines, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE.
These are some of the tools and weapons used by SOE in their work. One item which we have here looks like a pipe, but in fact it's a pistol. You can place a .22 cartridge in the chamber there, close it, and here we have a trigger. The stem of the pipe forms the barrel of the gun. This pencil contains a compass, a miniature compass of about 3 millimeters in diameter. We have saws, it was wrapped in card. There's a saw there hidden in a piece of rubber. Another SOE device is this tear gas pen. That little ball bearing is actually the trigger, which can be hidden by the pen clip. And you move that round and press it. Some more conventional weapons were used, obviously, during the war by SOE. This little Spanish 6.35mm pistol was the kind of pistol which SOE were very keen to get hold of because they could arm their agents with it who were out in the field, and if they were found with it, it wouldn't necessarily link them with British intelligence. And familiarity with this sort of weapon may well have been what led Ian Fleming to select this pistol, the Beretta 1919, as a suitable weapon he thought to arm James Bond with in the first of his books. It's rather better made than the Spanish pistol, but it's still chambered for the 6.35mm cartridge, which is a round of fairly marginal lethality.
But several novels later, Fleming would change his mind about Bond's Beretta. And this time, the inspiration would come from an unusual source, one of his readers.
He was contacted soon after, I think, the second Bond book came out by a man called Boothroyd, who was a brilliant gun expert, who said, you've got to swap Bond's guns. He's not using the right gun. You've got to get him a different gun.
Boothroyd told Fleming that the Beretta was a lady's gun and suggested a more powerful alternative, the Walther PPK. A grateful Fleming returned the favor by turning Boothroyd into a character in Dr. No.
M. Setback. You may not know it, 007, but Major Boothroyd's the greatest small arms expert in the world. He wouldn't be here if he wasn't.
What Fleming then realised is that there were so many handgun fanatics out there who were so interested in what Bond was doing with his gun that they would write to Fleming, and Fleming would just send the letters straight on to Boothroyd. And he ended up lecturing on the 007 circuit and became a star, in fact, technical consultant for the first James Bond film.
But Fleming's readers didn't just tell him to swap Bond's handguns. In fact, it was another 007 fan who persuaded Fleming to change Bond's car into the legendary Aston Martin.
Bond originally starts out by driving a Bentley, which was a museum piece even by the 1950s. And this reader thought that Bond really needed something a bit more modern. And what about the DB3? And why doesn't Fleming go and try it? And Fleming did, and decided that this was the car. And 50 years later, James Bond is still driving an Aston Martin. So probably the greatest car franchise ever.
By the time the movies were made, Bond had the latest Aston Martin, the DB5, complete with revolving number plates, secret guns, an onboard transmitter, and lethal wheel scythes to push other cars off the road. As the movies became bigger and bolder, Bond's gadgets and vehicles built from the books became even more fantastical. You Only Live Twice featured the extraordinary miniature gyrocopter Little Nellie, designed and flown by pilot Ken Wallace.
The Little Nellie is very much for real, actually. Right from the start, I decided that these had a working role. She has a sister that has been back in military markings and has been taking part in further military trials. She's been carried in a C-130 Hercules, been flown into the battle area, and the moment the C-130 has landed, she's rolled down and they've got eyes in the sky. Apart from the reconnaissance capability, she has a ground attack capability. She could carry as many as 6 of them if necessary. There's no question about it, she could attack as well as do reconnaissance.
Even at the ripe old age of 93, Ken Wallace still flies gyrocopters. When Little Nellie appeared in the movie, the Bond producers wanted her to look even more dangerous for the film's famous battle sequence.
I asked when Commander Wallace to come to Pinewood and